Hello and welcome to another lecture for Introduction to Psychology. In this lecture we will be talking about language and education. You see that education is added on there, as well as these slides are a little bit different than previous ones because in this set of slides I don't follow your book as closely. I have more experience teaching this topic as a separate topic, so when I teach this topic and I include education into the language part, even though it's very brief at the end, I do make it a bit different than, like I said, what your book's going to cover. So if you read the book, that's good information. It is going to still supplement this, but then I'm going to include more in this lecture about things like development of language rather than some of the straight up quirks of language. But we'll look at some of the aphasias, we'll look at a few various different things, and we'll even finish up with, when we're talking about language, we'll finish up talking about things like how language shapes cognition, as well as dialects and slang. But for the most part, we're going to be looking at it more from a developmental perspective. So what we're going to look at here is first, what is language? We'll then incorporate nature versus nurture, because just like in the other things we've talked about, nature versus nurture comes in, but when it comes to language, there's actually been a pretty big fight between theorists in this domain. We'll look at the development of language, and then we'll move on to language disorders. And as I said, I'm going to squeeze in there after the language disorders a bit about language and cognition and language and culture. And then we'll finish up with education in science and mathematics. So first we need to define language. And when we're defining language, we don't just take and look at language in ways that we view it now. We look at language in ways of how does it work in the definition. So language is defined as a communication system in which a limited number of signals, so you see I've already got that bolded, but I'll underline it as well. A limited number of signals, and these signals can be sounds, letters, gestures. So any of these things count as signals. It's not just vocalized. It can be the gestures, it can be written. Then these limited number of signals are combined according to basically agreed upon rules within the language to produce an infinite number of messages. Finite number of signals combined to produce an infinite number of messages. And this is essentially how language works. And when we look at this, we need to now, well, what is the difference between language and communication? Because language is a unique human thing. Humans are the only species to have true language. Now, yes, dolphins and whales are believed to have an almost rudimentary language. Chimpanzees can be, and orangutans and gorillas can be taught sign language, so they have the capacity for language, but they don't develop it on their own. They don't use it on their own. So when we look at what is language and we look at as far as in humans, humans are the only species that we know of that have true language. Those other examples I'm talking about, and many more species beyond that, have communication. They have a way to communicate that isn't defined as language because it's not this, going back, this limited number of signals producing an infinite number of messages. You look at things like even prairie dogs, meerkats, things like that. They have different chirps that indicate different predators. So they'll have ones that are on the lookout. A specific chirp is given. That means that it's either a land-based predator, a sky-based predator, things like that. So they do have an ability to communicate. However, it's limited to a few different messages, so it's not that infinite number of messages. And again, the same we can look at with dolphins and whales, even though they've even used things like names and stuff like that, so their communication is much more advanced. They're at that point of the limited number of signals producing an infinite number of messages, at least as far as we're aware. When we're talking about language, we have to look at the properties of the language. We have to look at what makes it up and what it is, again, that's about what makes language so unique. So because of that, again, ability to combine into an infinite amount of messages, we can use language to communicate almost anything we can think of. Objects, events, ideas. We can make up new words when we need them. I'll just use the word cellular phone, cell phone. That is a new word. Now it's not that new. It's been around since the late 80s, early 90s. But the point is a new object was created and a new word had to be created to fit it. Now sometimes new words are combinations of old words. Sometimes we come up with a new term for it. Either way, we make up new words as they're needed. Another big component of language is the ability to talk about non-shared events, the past, the future, fantasy, things that are imagined in your head. Those types of things are things that, due to language, we can communicate. Whereas, again, in other species that communicate, they might be able to communicate specific things, but they just can't, they don't have that ability to refer to the past, the future, things like that without language. And finally, the ability to transmit knowledge to the next generation. And we'll get to this a little bit more when we talk about culture, but because any cognitively intact child can learn language easily, they can learn what is being conveyed through language easily. And again, this is basically unique to humans. Yes, we know of tribes of chimpanzees that can communicate to their children. They teach their children. There is training that goes on there. There is learning that goes on. And you get this in many species, but chimpanzees are one of the prototypical non-human examples of passing on knowledge. However, because they don't have true language, they just have ways to communicate, the information that gets passed on does not tend to stay consistent. So if you find this, they've had chimps that were raised in captivity. They were raised in either labs or in zoos or various different things like this, where they learned from humans how to do certain things. And you can watch ones that were released into the wild, how they act and behave, and it's very interesting that they pass on a lot of that information, or a lot of that knowledge, a lot of those skills that they learn when being part of captivity with humans. They pass that on to their offspring. They pass that on to other chimpanzees. However, after about a generation, that stops being passed on, so their children don't necessarily pass it on to their children. It's very limited in the ability to pass that information on to future generations, whereas again, humans are unique there. Along those lines, language is a human universal. All cultures have language. Even beyond that, deaf children who aren't taught sign language invent sign language. In cases where a deaf child is born in an area where there is no sign language, they'll invent their own sign language that people around them, their caregivers, things like that, know what they're trying to convey. When children are put together with others who don't speak the same language, they themselves can basically learn how to mix their languages together. The term Creole we use to, as an example, New Orleans has a Creole language, so whenever the word Creole is talked about, many people think of that, but really what that word means is an amalgamation of languages. It's a mixture of different languages. Children whose parents move to different places. There's a perfect example of this where a bunch of different people from different nations move to a region for work. They moved to that region for work. Their children spent a lot of time together, and while the adults tended to just congregate with other people that spoke their own language, the children, they interacted with those who spoke other languages, and they themselves created a Creole language, a language that was an amalgamation of a bunch of different languages, and how that mixed together to allow them to communicate. You see this in South Africa, where English is mixed with some of the native languages that were there to get what is spoken by some now. And you find, like I said, you find this all over the world. It's because children especially will invent or mix languages when they are interacting with others. Language also develops similarly across all cultures. But that being said, they're unique. Each language is unique, but they have some similarities, or they're essentially the same is one way to say it. There are language universals, that is, rules that describe similarities and differences amongst languages. I'm not going to go into it more here, but there are, you do have differences between languages. Our grammatical structure is different in different languages. English is actually one of the hardest languages because its grammatical structure is different than most other languages. That being said, even though there are differences between languages, there are still these universals that are present across languages. Next thing I'll talk about is psycholinguistics. So psycholinguistics is basically the study of language in cognitive psychology, and it's the study of the process by which humans acquire and process or think about language. There are 4 important components here. The first is comprehension. This is where when language is produced, so language sounds are produced, it is the processing of the sounds that are taken in. So it's the understanding of words, sentences, stories. We talked about sensory memory and short-term memory and how this facilitates language, but now it takes it one step farther in that this is how the mind processes it. Just as important is speech production. This is the physical and mental process involved in producing language. So producing speech, or in the case of sign language or writing, it's the mental process of producing that language. Then you've got representation. This is how language is represented in the brain and how people combine words into phrases. When you think about it, it's one of those things that we take for granted as our ability for our minds to process language at such a rapid rate that you can understand what someone else is saying as well as communicate out what you are thinking or what you want conveyed. So as I'm sitting here talking, in my mind, my brain is basically processing what I want to say, and then it is combining what I want to say, the words, it's combining the information into words, it's combining those words into phrases, and those phrases into statements that is then conveyed to you as language, and you are then comprehending it. Your brain is processing what I am saying and breaking that down into from sounds to words to meanings. And then the 4th important component for psycholinguistics is acquisition, which is how we learn language. This is basically a separate form of psycholinguistics, but it's just as important, and that is looking at how the brain works in learning new languages. I'm not going to go into that too much. I am going to go into the development of language, but one thing that's one of the interesting findings from acquisition of language is that our minds solidify, or most people's minds solidify at about the age of 12 to 13. What that means is that about the age of 12 to 13, it becomes more difficult to learn a new language. Prior to that, it is much easier. Actually, in infancy, in toddlerhood, it's the easiest to learn a new language. If you don't use it, you lose it, just like when we were talking about things in previous lectures. But it's easiest at a young age, but in most people at about 12 to 13, you lose the ability to easily learn a new language. Doesn't mean you can't learn it, it just becomes much more difficult. That all being said, there are some people that are their brains don't solidify in the same way, and they go on and have the ability, even as an adult, to be able to easily learn new languages. These are the people that know 8, 9, 10 languages, and it's simply because their minds work in a different way than others, and they can continue to easily learn new languages. Let's look at that nature versus nurture discussion I was talking about before, and that is now we're going to look at the environment in learning. So we're going to look at the nature versus nurture within language acquisition. So learning theorists, the all environment side, believe that language is basically influenced, language development is influenced by their environment. That if you are put in an environment with language, you'll learn it. If you're put in an environment without language, you won't learn it. That type of thing. So learning theorists, the environmental theorists, when it comes to language development, believe that it's all about nurture. It's all about the environment that you're in. The problem is that imitation, reinforcement, all of these types of things are not the best explanation for how children acquire syntax and grammatical rules. It just doesn't fully explain how children in all cultures universally develop language in a similar way. So then you get nativists like Chomsky who believe that humans have genetic capacity to learn language. So Chomsky's he's an older researcher now. He's a linguist. He does philosophy stuff. He's pretty controversial at times. He said some things that some people really get offended by. If you're interested, I recommend looking him up at Noam Chomsky. And he's an interesting guy. I'm not going to say I like him, but he's an interesting guy. But he was one of the big early proponents of basically the nature side, the genetic side of capacity to learn language. He was said we're equipped with universal grammar, system of common rules, properties for learning any language in the world. And again, just like the strict learning theorists, this doesn't fully explain language, because whereas the learning theorists couldn't explain how language acquisition was similar across cultures, the nativists can explain how there's differences between languages, how some languages have different grammar rules, things like that. So because of that, what really most theorists now are, and even Chomsky now is this, but what most theorists now are is interactionists. So they believe that both learning theorists and nativists are correct, that we do have biologically based competencies, these biologically based genetics that allow us to learn language and guide our language development. But also important is the culture, the society, the environment we learn the language in, as well as what language we are taught. I'll come back to this later when I talk about language and cognition, but one of the big things is different languages can actually make you think differently. So being bilingual actually can shape the way or change the way you think, but I'll come back and talk about that later. For now, just note that modern theorists are interactionists. They believe that both are important, and there is evidence that both are correct. Let's look at comprehension, or not comprehension, but neurobiology real quick. So neurobiology of language is looking at what parts of the brain are important in language, and I'm not going to get into them all. I'm going to get into two areas, because the truth of the matter is there are many areas in the brain that are responsible for language. Pretty much anywhere of the cortex is going to be related to language. We think in words. Even though we think in pictures as well, we think in words too. So because of that, different parts of the brain are going to be working on language. However, there are two main areas of the brain where language occurs. First is Wernicke's area. It's not Wernicke's, it's Wernicke's. It's a German name, so the W becomes a V, so Wernicke's. Wernicke's area is where information is comprehended. Language is processed and comprehended. So Wernicke's area, when somebody is speaking to you, when somebody is doing sign language to you, when somebody gestures, even if you don't know sign language, gestures, any type of language communication that's coming in is processed in Wernicke's area, and this is where comprehension comes in. So damage to Wernicke's will do damage to comprehension. And then Broca's area is where it's turned into speech. So when you are communicating with others, specifically with speech, it is basically produced in Broca's area. Now, that all being said, I'm going to throw a wrench in that and say that while Wernicke's is mainly responsible for comprehension and Broca's is mainly responsible for production, that isn't fully the case, in that they both have properties of doing both. If you remember in one of the previous slides, I talked about double dissociation and how if you have damage to one area of the brain, it will have one effect, and if you have damage to another area of the brain, it'll have an opposite effect. It'll have an effect on something else, but not on that first thing. And that's how we know that the areas of the brain are responsible for different things. Well, damage to either Wernicke's or Broca's will affect both comprehension and production of speech. It's just damage in Wernicke's will affect comprehension more, damage in Broca's will affect production more. And we know this in stroke patients and stuff like that. And I have a couple videos later on where you'll see instances of aphasias, which is damage to these parts of the brain that cause production or comprehension areas for each of these two areas. So let's look at mastering language next. And one of them already popped up, but we're going to look at the 6 different systems, in a sense, or 6 different categories of language. So we've got, again, mastering language, it's where words or symbols or gestures and rules are mastered. So we've got phonemes, morphemes, syntax, sematics, pragmatics, and prosody. The first is phonemes. A phoneme is a basic unit of sound that can change the meaning of the word. So and I'll write over here on the right, let's look at basic unit of sound. So let's say you've got a phoneme of ba. Now, we're going to take that phoneme twice, but we're going to change the second phoneme, we're going to stick to it. We're going to do the t sound or the d sound. And that changes that phoneme of t or d, changes when mixed with the first phoneme of ba, changes it from bat to bad. So it changes the meaning of the word by just changing a basic unit of sound. Phonetics is a very interesting way of studying languages. There's actually a phonetic alphabet that has a symbol or letter for every different phoneme that is produced in all human languages. And there's only about 46 of them. So it's pretty limited. I don't know the exacts. I'm not a linguist. But it's pretty limited in the amount of different phonemes we have. But phonetics is the way where you can then take and actually learn pronunciations of other languages properly if you learn how to understand and master the phonetic alphabet. Then you've got morphemes. Morphemes are the basic unit of meaning that exists in a word. So when we look at this bat and bad, A morpheme in this case is the full word bat, the full word bad. But if I use the word, let's say, fire truck, the word fire truck has two morphemes within it, even though it's only one word. So morphemes are the basic units of meaning. In this case, it would be fire and truck, but you can mix them together to make fire truck, which is an extra meaning to it. Syntax is our rules for forming sentences. And as I said before, syntax, our rules for forming sentences, differ across languages. Our noun, verb, adjective order differs in different languages. Any of you that are bilingual already know this. Any of you that have learned a little bit about other languages probably know this. But if you don't know much about other languages, note that the structure of sentences is different in different languages. Then you get the semantics, not syntax, but semantics. Semantics is the understanding of the different meanings of language. So semantics is how basically the brain understands language. And then the final one, we've got pragmatics, sorry. Pragmatics of language are the rules of using language in different contexts. So in this case, it would be the differences between how you talk to your parents and how you talk to your friends. That's rules for using language in different contexts. How you talk to your boss, how you talk to your teacher, how you talk to your friends, how you talk to your siblings, how you talk to your parents. We talk in different ways. We use different types of language. We use different inflections. We use different words. We use all of that differently in these different contexts. So pragmatics of language are the rules for that. And then now the final one, that's prosody. Prosody is how sounds are produced. So how the mouth, the larynx, all of that, the lungs, all of that combines to produce sounds. So prosody is how the sounds are produced. A lot of basically information on language drops prosody out, but prosody is an important component because a lot of the language disorders that are out there are relating to prosody. And that is, what I mean by that is children who are having difficulty with language, it's usually a prosody disorder, meaning they're having a problem producing certain sounds. So when you get people with like a lisp or other things like that, there are certain sounds that they have difficulty producing. Now that we've discussed the basics of language, we now need to discuss the basics of communication. So language is used to communicate. So we talked about before how animals communicate. Humans have language though, but language is still a means of communicating. And for when we talk about communication though, we have to look at the communication intents. So the communication intents are these 7 different things you see here on this slide. And it's interesting that we can break down communication into these 7 things. But basically all communication boils down to one of these 7. Either a request. So when you're communicating, and using language, but when you're communicating, you may be requesting something. You may be requesting information. You may be requesting an object. You may be requesting an action. You may be requesting a behavior, those types of things. Protest, which means basically an objection to something. Comment, so to make a comment on something. It is almost a way of supplementing the information that's there. So when we make a comment, we are not requesting or protesting. We are essentially just adding to information that's there. The next is response to a request. So a reply to those requests we talked about before. Yes, no, in a minute. Indications that it's not possible, indications that it's possible, that type of thing. Next is calling attention to something. And this can be, the communication here can be as simple as looking at something, and then that shared eye gaze we have in humans, but calling attention to something is one of the basic communication intents. A response to a call, so you call attention, a response to it, and then finally a greeting. And what is interesting here is that even in non-humans, you find these communication intents in many species. Now, maybe not the comment one, but you can definitely get animals. Let's even look at pets. Let's look at dogs. They can request to be fed. They can request to go for a walk. They are attempting to communicate that to you. They can protest something, like if they get hurt or something. They can respond to a request. You ask them if they want to go outside, they respond. You can call their attention to something by pointing or looking. Dogs do share gaze with humans. They're one of the very few species out there that do shared gaze, and dogs will do it with humans. And so if you look at something, the dog will look at it as well. They can respond to a call. You call their name, they bark, that type of thing. And greeting, when you first come up to them, they may act a certain way. That's a communication intent. So you can see these communication intents even in animals. Comment, not as much, but even then you could have it where maybe you're singing and they start barking as well. They're commenting on it. That's a stretch, but we'll go with it. Next, let's look at milestones and vocalization. I'm going to go through this pretty quick just because this is the developmental side. So if you're interested in more of this, go to developmental. But I have a few slides of this. I just want to go through these. So at around 6 to 8 weeks of age, babies start cooing. That is, repeating vowel sounds such as ooh and ah. They tend to do this when they're content, and they'll just do it over and over. Ooh, ooh, ah, that type of thing. So that starts at about 2 months of age. Then at about 4 to 6 months of age, they start babbling. And this is where they'll repeat a consonant-vowel combination. So the cooing was vowel sounds. The babbling, now they get consonant-vowel sounds. Ba, 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 that type of thing. And sometimes they're doing it just for the pleasure of making noise. Sometimes they're doing it with a communication intent. Typically, though, it's just they're practicing producing sounds. And later babbling, later on, can start to include more than just the two sounds, more than just ba, ba, ba. So it can start to include 3, 4 more repeated sounds. So up to this point, we really don't have communication. We've just got production going on. And why is it that the production isn't really getting to communication? Well, part of it's because the brain isn't fully developed, and part of it's because the ability to produce sounds is not fully developed. So about 5 to 9 months, you get jargon. This is where communication starts. Now, jargon is where babies will have a sound for something that's not an actual word. They don't have yet the capacity to produce actual words, or at least not that many. They can't use their mouth in such a way that they can produce intended words. However, they can make certain sounds. They've been making sounds for months now, and they may start attributing some of those sounds to different things. So they might point to their bear and make an oohing sound, and the next day they point to the bear and make an oohing sound again. That is where they've got now jargon, where they have sounds for things that are not actually words. Then we need to look at comprehension versus production. So we've looked at now the sounds they're making. Let's look at how they comprehend. Comprehension of words occurs before production. However, comprehension doesn't occur as early as some people think. Some people think that babies can comprehend much more than they're letting on from an early age. But what we know from research is that at about 10 months old, the average infant can only comprehend about 50 words. They don't yet produce any of them. Again, they cannot, produce these words, but at 10 months they only are actually comprehending about 50 words. Even if they might be paying attention to someone talking, really what they're at a younger age than this, really what's going on there is it's more of they are interested in the person talking, but they don't understand what the person's saying. Then at about a year old, infants understand many familiar words. So from 10 months to a year, their understanding, their comprehension of words goes up by a lot. And they learn to use cues to connect words with whatever the word is meaning. So they'll look at what the person, in this I already mentioned a couple times, joint attention, joint gaze, where you look at something, an infant will look at something, and if you look at something and call it something, that infant will categorize that away, store that away as being what the name for that thing. Next, you get the first words. So this tends to be at about 1 year of age. It is a special event for most people, and the first words, and there's a few that come pretty quickly, but the first words are all what are called hollow phrases. So hollow phrases are words that will convey entire sentences. So let's say one of the first words an infant produces is the word bear. They will use that word to mean an entire sentence. They may point at the bear, and by the way they're saying bear, that might be interpreted to mean, hey, that's the bear. And I mean a teddy bear here. Or they might point at the teddy bear and say bear in such a way that it's understood that that means they want the teddy bear. Or even bear in such a way that it's understood that that means that the bear is being scary. Stuff like that. The word bear becomes in any of these hollow phrases becomes a word that in this sense means an entire sentence. At the same time as their first words, they begin to use nonverbal symbols, gestures, pointing, raising arms. They can actually, even a little bit before this, be taught sign language. So babies can be taught sign language before they typically start talking, and about the same time that most babies start talking, and even babies that do start talking, at the same time that babies start talking, they can be taught even more sign language. That is because, again, why aren't they producing these words? It's because the brain regions and the mouth and the various muscles and things like that, the fine motor skills in the mouth, are not developed enough to produce the words, but there's enough comprehension there that if they know sign language and it's an easy sign, they can do that sign to communicate. And early on, language acquisition is pretty slow for language production. Not knowing language, but vocabulary acquisition. So being able to produce language, it does proceed about one word at a time. And even though that first word comes at 12 months, by about 18 months, most children can actually only produce about 30 to 50 words. In those children learning sign language, they can actually produce more. So this isn't a problem of the brain not being able to understand it. This is, again, a problem of learning how to produce these words. After 18 months, what occurs is basically a vocabulary spurt that takes that 30 to 50 words to the adult tens of thousands of words. However, what ends up occurring with this rapid vocabulary acquisition that can occur during these times is infants will make mistakes. There's two main types of mistakes that are made during this time. The first is overextension. This is the use of a word to refer to too broad of a range of objects. So where they might they see a horse for the first time and they call it a dog because they know the word dog. Or underextension, the use of a word in too narrow of a fashion. So they use the word dog, or they know the word dog, and they see their dog is a tiny little dog, and let's say it's a Boston Terrier or something like that, and then they see a Great Dane. They don't know that that's a dog, and they don't apply the word dog, because they're using the word dog in too narrow of a fashion. Now, normally here I would ask something like, well, what is going on here? But since we haven't talked about the full cognition yet, and we didn't talk about how cognitive processes work, I can't at this point talk about, well, what's going on here. But what's going on here, and if you want to look it up or kind of as a preview of something we'll talk about later, what's going on here is that schemas, which is schema is the way our brain represents the world and how things in the world are represented. Schemas are being formed during this time. And this overextension and underextension are actually two errors in schemas that we have. And that is we make our schemas too broad or too specific. Then later comes telegraphic speech. Telegraphic speech is where you have 2-word or even 3-word sentences. Want bear, have bear, things like that, where you've got 2, sometimes 3 words. 18 to 24 months of age, this is when this rapid acquisition of vocabulary is going on, and you're starting to get sentences now. However, what ends up occurring during this time is something very interesting called overregularization. And this is where language development actually can cause errors, even regressions. These words that you see here, foots, goad, mouses, where a certain rule of language isn't universal. So we typically apply an S to the end of a word to make it plural in English. Well, some words aren't that way. We don't do that with foots. We don't do that with feet. We don't do that with mouse. We don't call them mouses or mooses or any of those types of things. We have a lot of different things where they just don't, that rule doesn't apply. Well, kids during this time will apply that rule too liberally and get words wrong. And what I mean when I said that sometimes they'll regress here is that even if a kid used the word properly before this, so they said feet when referring to 2 feet, they may later say foots because they regress in applying these rules. We talked about varied communication before, but even at a preschool age, children start to use varied communication depending on who they're talking to. They'll actually use simpler language when talking to younger children than to peers. They'll talk in more of a formal way to adults, things like that. So varied communication starts at a very early age. Then looking at later language development, the average first grader starts school with a vocabulary of about 10,000 words. That's quite a bit in a 4-year period. About 2,500 words per year, somewhere in that range. And then they're still at that point in time adding between 5 and 13 new words a day throughout elementary school. So by the time they get to middle school, they know tens of thousands of words. In middle childhood and adolescence, you get metalinguistic awareness. This is where words themselves aren't as important as the knowledge of language as a system becomes important, where you begin to understand how language works, and through that, you're able to communicate in more effective ways. And along those terms, adolescents are much better able to understand and define abstract terms, infer meanings, stuff like that. And that's when we went back to Piaget's stages and how in adolescence the thinking becomes more abstract. Well, this is part of that, is being able to think in a way that's more abstract allows you to understand and define language in a way that is more abstract. Next, let's go over language disorders really quick. So it's actually the most common type of disorder in early childhood is a language disorder. And what it's defined as is the development of, or difficulty in development of, one or more areas of language. And it can be either developmental or acquired. What does that mean? It can be due to a problem of development. It can be due to a problem of genetics. It can be due to a psychological issue. All of these different types of things. I'm not going to go into specific ones because this isn't a developmental class, but note that there is a lot of different child language disorders that are present. I used lisping as an example earlier. Stuttering is another one. The list is long in the different types of disorders that are there. You can also have adult language disorders. These can also be developmental, such as an adult SLI, or they can be acquired, such as an aphasia due to like a brain trauma or a brain injury, a stroke, things like that, which is the two we'll talk about in just a minute. SLI is specific learning impairment, by the way, and that goes back to the childhood disorders. So the two main things we're going to look at are what's called aphasias. These are acquired language issues that are usually due to a traumatic brain injury of some form or another. So traumatic brain injury can be get in an accident and hit your head. It can be due to concussions. It can be due to things like repeated concussions. But it can also be due to things like a stroke. Having a stroke in the brain causes a part of the brain to die off. That can cause these aphasias. The first of the two aphasias we'll look at, or we're going to talk about real quick, is Broca's aphasia. So if you remember, Broca's was responsible for production of language. So this is one where damage to the Broca's area, it can cause mild to moderate comprehension difficulties, because remember what I said before is that there is that overlap between Broca's and Wernicke's. So Broca's aphasia still does cause some comprehension difficulties. However, what is really difficult, what becomes a really big problem is difficulty with verbal expression. Even things like reading aloud is difficult. And I should point out here that this isn't, even though there might be mild to moderate comprehension, the person reading this, let's say you have someone read a book who has Broca's aphasia. If they read it to themselves, they mostly will understand it. However, if you ask them to read it out loud, they will not be able to properly convey the words. They might make errors in what they're saying, stuff like that. On the next slide is a example of someone with Broca's aphasia. You can tell and he does have some comprehension difficulties, but this is like a extreme case of Broca's aphasia. And when you watch this, note that to him, when he is saying stuff in his mind, his mind is trying to produce what he's thinking. What is coming out of his mouth is something else entirely. So in his mind, he's basically saying the right thing. Even if he listens to his words, he's not. But in his mind, it's producing the right thing. It's just not coming out of his mouth as the right thing. And it's a very interesting case. Watch that.
However, we shall see how effective this patient is at manipulating his intonation of this utterance. The segments you will see are, first, a conversation about his upcoming move to a new house, followed next by a sample of his spontaneous automatic speech.
But tell me, why is it that you're moving, actually? Is it because the kids have grown and the house is getting too big, or ready for a smaller place? Seems reasonable. Less to keep up.
Don't turn on.
Yeah. Now, all your children are grown, right? How many children do you have? Right. Can you count that out for me? All right. What number is this? Right? Right. Now let's count it out.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Nice, nice. Well, since you did 4 so well, let's go for broke. Let's go up to 20 if we can.
What's up? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 1, 2,
Okay, 1.
So again, that's a very interesting video, and as you saw there at the end of the video, he's working with a speech pathologist, a speech therapist, to try and train his mind to produce speech correctly, and at times he was able to produce the speech correctly. But it is a long process, a long, complicated process to reacquire the ability to produce language properly. All right, the next one we're going to look at is Wernicke's aphasia. This is injury to the Wernicke's area of the brain, and comprehension, or I shouldn't even say that, production, not comprehension. Production may be still pretty good. However, there is a big difficulty with comprehension. One of the issues here, and as you're going to see on the next video, one of the problems with this though is even though speech production is still intact, the words that are said are tend to be very jumbled, much like Broca's aphasia, but that is more to do with the comprehension side and the overlap that Broca's and Wernicke's have. So writing is fluent and legible. So the person is able to at least produce in writing a good ability to convey the language. The reading may even be intact because Wernicke's is closer to or is responsible for heard language. So the reading may be intact, not always though. However, when it comes to actual language, the comprehension is where the issue is. There's a video on the next slide of this. Enjoy that.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment, they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was really good and happy. And I play golf and hit other trees. We play out with the hands. We save a lot of hands on hold for us, other hands. I don't know what you get, but I talk with a lot of hand for him. Sometime. Am I talk of any more to saying?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I hope the world lasts for you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
I like that video because it basically does a good job of showing how comprehension is working in all of that. He is not really understanding what the person is saying. and a few times he can kind of understand, and you can tell he's inferring from body language other things, because it's vocal communication that is jumbled. It's not the body language that's jumbled. It would be like someone speaking a foreign language to you. But then when he's talking, his language is also a bit jarbled because of that overlap between the two. So it's just, and again, he's working with a speech pathologist to get through these issues, and that's speech pathologists spend a lot of time on working with these aphasias. Both of those individuals were stroke victims, where they had damage to their parts of the brain that were responsible for either production or comprehension of language. So it again just shows how interesting these parts of the brain are. Okay, next let's look at language and comprehension, or not language and comprehension, language and cognition. So the first thing we're going to just, I'm not going to talk much on this slide because I have a TED Talk on the next slide that's already really long, that's going to say just about everything I could say in a good manner, with good examples. But what we need to talk about here first is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is basically that the structure of language, how an individual language is structured, shapes our perception of the world, shapes our categorization of the world, and shapes our categorization of experiences. It shapes basically how language shapes how we think, how we behave, how we feel, all of those. We're going to watch a video in just a minute, the TED Talk video, but I will talk about emotion first. They don't talk about emotion in the TED Talk, but in the next set of slides I'll actually talk about emotion. But how language shapes emotion is interesting, and that'll come up in the next set of slides. We'll talk about it again, but what's going on here is that some languages have words for emotions and some don't have words for specific emotions. And what you actually find is that people are more likely to feel emotions if there's a word for them. So when it's a really interesting concept of just the way we feel is shaped by our language. And then on the next slide, you'll get the TED Talk. One thing I want to say just before we get into that is those that are bilingual, multilingual, depending on what language they're thinking in, it can actually change their personality. This video is going to talk about things like how language for direction, time, counting, math, colors, masculine, feminine, intent, all of these affect basically who we are and the way we think and feel. It's a longer TED Talk. You may want to speed it up, but I really do feel that this TED Talk is important to watch for this concept. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about with language before we switch to education for a few slides is language and culture. And there's a really big saying that in cultural psychology about how language affects culture, and that is this: that language shapes culture, but culture shapes language. It's a reciprocal process. They work on each other. It's interactive. What do I mean by language shapes culture? Well, the language that we have, if it shapes all of those things that was talked about on that previous TED Talk, then it's going to shape how we act and behave. That's going to shape things like how we create our rule systems, what becomes the norms in a culture. So language shapes culture, but culture then works reciprocally and shapes language as well. And that does it through changing language to fit the cultural ideals. And the final thing I'm just going to talk about really quick is dialects, slang, the terms here, and then I'll give an example. But dialects and slang, why do we have so many different dialects for languages? Why do we have so much slang? One of the things here when it comes to culture is language is used as a tool to determine who's in the in-group and who's in the out-group. And that's why you get languages that drift apart, and you can look at the evolution of languages, how languages, when we even look at like the Latin languages, the love languages that turned into specific languages, Portuguese, Spanish, French. You've got the Germanic languages that came out into more of some of the other modern languages we have. The point is that languages change over time. One of the things that shapes how they change, though, is the fact that we use language as humans to determine who is like us and who is not like us. We're not talking here about appearances. That's an entirely separate lecture. We're talking here about how people use language to determine in-group versus out-group. One example of this, I'm going to give two examples real quick. One example, the first one I'll give, and then I'll let you skip the slide if you want to skip the second one, because that one, I'll give the disclaimer before we get to that one. But before I get to either of these, I want to talk about how I know these and what goes into this. I travel the world a lot. I enjoy traveling. I have actually a good friend in Prague in Czech Republic who I visit typically once to twice a year. Not necessarily going to Prague, but we meet at conferences and things like that. But I've been to Prague a few times now. Unfortunately, didn't get to see him this year because of everything going on with the coronavirus. Was actually supposed to be going there next week to a conference in England, but that's not happening, obviously. But the point is that I spend a lot of time traveling internationally, and I spend a lot of time interacting with people from other cultures. And the first example I'm going to give here for in-group versus out-group and how dialects work and really just how languages change and become their own language is an example from Czech Republic and Slovakia. So Czech Republic and Slovakia used to be one country called Czechoslovakia. It's been, I think, 30 years now since it broke up into two separate countries. And what is the big deal there, or the issue is that they both spoke the same language. They both spoke Czech when they were still the same country. However, when they split into separate countries and Slovakia split off, Slovakia really wanted to differentiate itself from Czech. They wanted from the Czech Republic. They wanted to be seen as separate. So what they actually did is their government changed a bunch of words to be something else, so that their language was distinct, so that their language was not Czech. So now there is a language called Slovakian that did not exist 30 years ago. And what's interesting is that if you take people who are over 30 years old from Slovakia and people that are over 30 years old from Czech Republic and get them together and have them talk, they will perfectly be able to understand each other. They can communicate fine. There's no issues there. However, if you take kids, those that are younger than 30 from Czech Republic and those that are younger than 30 from Slovakia, mix them together, they actually have problems communicating because enough words have changed now that it makes two languages. And again, why did Slovakia do this? Because they wanted a sense of national identity, a in-group versus out-group, so they formed this language they changed their language in such a way that they could use it as that. Okay, I spent a lot of time on this slide. What I'm going to say now is I'm going to give another example. However, this example is pretty vulgar. I'm going to use swear words. That's because it's pertinent to the example. If you don't want to listen to that, go on to the next slide now. If you want to listen to it, I will get to that in about 5 seconds. Okay. My example is this, and this goes back to my friend in Czech Republic again, and that is, he is actually pretty proficient in English. However, he learned English through England, through British English. So there is a difference between British English and American English in a lot of different dialect and a lot of different slang used. And what goes on here is the fact that he learned it. He spent some of his teenage years in Britain, so he learned the British dialect of English. However, this actually can cause issues. If you ever watch any British television, they try and keep it pretty simple. They probably try to keep the slang down, but they still use words that are just, you might not understand. You see this also with Australian English, and how Australians use English in a different way, and they've got different slang. You even get different dialects in different parts of the country in the US of American English, where you get these different dialects where it can sometimes be hard to understand, and different slang that comes in. However, my example here is that my buddy from Czech Republic, there was a group of us together, a bunch of Americans and some people from Czech Republic, some people from various other places, and he was talking and he was impassioned about talking about something, and there was somebody who'd angered him, and he used the term that when referring to this dude, that this dude, he could fuck him off. Well, there in British English, that actually means that the dude could just leave. He could go away. In American English, that means something different. That means wanting to have sex with them or something to that effect. So you can see here, and in that case, everybody was confused, and when it was explained, everybody laughed, and it was funny, and just how dialect and slang can really have an effect on language. And again, there it was amusing, but there was confusion at first about what he was actually saying because of the differences between even different versions of English. Okay, so let's move on to education now. Education, we've only got a few slides to talk about education, but it is important to talk about when we're talking about cognition and language, so this is just a good time to throw it in. So we're going to, just like some of the other things, we're actually going to go throughout the lifespan. I teach it in as a developmental way, but that's simply because education is easiest taught that way. So we'll start with just looking at early years, preschool, the early years. Now, what is going on here is that research has actually suggested that there is a overemphasis on academics during the preschool years, and this actually affects achievement motivation. We'll talk about achievement motivation in a bit, but to give you an example of what's going on here, achievement motivation is just your motivation for achievement and how you attribute your successes and failures. What has been found, though, is preschool programs that stress both play and skill building can be beneficial to young children, especially from disadvantaged places. So this is one of those things. I get up on my soapbox whenever I talk about this. This lecture is longer than I'd intended, so I won't be up on it long. But one of the most beneficial things that has been found to help society as a whole is Head Start programs. Head Start programs are preschool programs that are typically designed for disadvantaged youth, and they are designed for those in poorer areas, but even in less poor areas it has its benefits. But what Head Start does is it incorporates the parents in the learning. It gives the children a chance to build play, social skills, as well as academic skills at a younger age. And Head Start programs have been linked to lower crime, lower drug use, and this is in adulthood. Those who had Head Start in early childhood, less crime in adulthood, less drug use in adulthood, higher chances of going to college, higher chances of having a job, all of those things. So the one simple thing that I feel, and there's a lot that could help society out there, definitely we see that going on right now, but one of probably the single biggest thing that I feel that could help American culture is implementing Head Start across the board. However, that being said, most states cut funding year after year after year for Head Start. So we see these programs that have been proven to have long-term beneficial consequences on the economy, on individuals, get finances cut now. And it's really just makes me shake my head, because a little bit of investment now means these people are going to be less of a drain on the system later, and even taxpayers later. That these, when I say these people, I mean the individuals who may, without this program, end up committing crimes, not having jobs, things like that. Then into childhood, we're going to get into attribution styles now. I told you I'd talk about achievement motivation. Well, attribution style is essentially that, or highly related to it, and that is that high achievers have what's called a healthy attribution style. A healthy attribution style is where individuals will attribute success to internal stable causes. So success is due to something the individual did, their ability, their ability to study, even stuff like that. But they attribute failures to external factors that are beyond their control. Or if it's an internal cause, it's one that they can overcome through effort. So those with the high achievers, they have the attribution style of blaming their successes on something they did, something they're good at, something that basically internal, but failures are due to something out of their control, or to if it's in their control, it's something that, well, they can give more effort in the future and then succeed. Whereas low achievers have what's called a helpless orientation attribution style, and we talked about this earlier when we talked about how rats will learned helplessness, where if you shock them in a way that they can't get away from it, they will just start, even if they later can get away from a shock, they won't try to, because they've got this helpless orientation. Well, in this case, they will attribute successes to luck. Low achievers attribute, if they succeed, well, they succeeded because of luck or because the test was easy, something outside. But they attribute their failures to internal lack of ability. So why did they fail at the test? Well, it's because they're not good enough, and no matter how hard they try, they'll never be good enough. That type of thing. So that's your difference between high achievers and low achievers. Let's move on to adolescence then. So adolescence, the transition from elementary school to middle school, achievement, motivation, self-esteem, grades all tend to decline in many children because of a few things. One, they're going through puberty, so their social interactions become more important. But also because maybe they become more realistically able to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses and lose self-esteem and high expectations of success as a result. I talked before earlier in the semester about how children at a young age might have these goals of being an astronaut or an NFL player, that type of thing. Well, at the transition into middle school and adolescence, they might start to understand that, no, that's not something that's possible, so they have a lowering of self-esteem and grades as a result. Though the one thing high academic achievement is associated with is those who come from a small, caring family with at least one stable parent who uses consistent discipline, again, that authoritative parenting style. Mothers who communicate with their middle school children about assuming responsibility and making decisions, again, authoritative parenting style. And the students' perceptions that parents are involved in their schooling. And if you remember, one of the things I said that Head Start did is got parents involved in the schooling at a young age. And this is one of those things, one of the strongest predictors of high achievement in school is parental involvement. So by Head Start encouraging more parental involvement, it gets that started at an early age. One of the last two things I'm going to talk about is science and math education. Just when we're talking about it, when we talk about education, we have to bring up our science and math education in the U.S. So even though US does score above the international average on math and science scores, it actually scores significantly below nations where science and math are a focus of education, such as the Southeast Asian nations. What is going on here? Well, one big component of it is how it's taught. So one of the interesting things here is a thing called new math. And some of you may have experienced this, and actually most places are now going to at least partial new math. Things like long division for math are a thing of the past, and parents get frustrated with it because they learn long division, but the kids aren't learning it that way. But the fact is that the new math way of teaching it is much better than the traditional way. What is going on with new math? And when I say new math, it's not new. It's an old method. It's been used in other countries for a long time. It's new to the US. New math is where basically the type of teaching shifts away from rote memorization into active thinking about the topics. One way I always explain this is in the US, typically you might have a math textbook that looks like this. It's very thick. So we've got, my art is obviously bad, but it's a very thick textbook. And this thick textbook, it has many, many, many lessons, many problems, and the traditional method of teaching math was that you went to a lesson, you memorized what the lesson was saying, which told you how to do a specific type of math, and then you did 25, 50 problems using that method of math. So you learned a new method, and then you did it so many times that you memorized how to do that new method. In Japan, though, a similar book would be about this thick. So we've got this thick American textbook that's got lots of lessons and lots of practice problems. Then you've got this thin Japanese math book. Well, what is the difference here? The Japanese math book has fewer problems of memorization, so you don't do the problems over and over again. It's got lessons in it, and it might have some problems, but mainly the method of doing math in Japan is a typical lesson will occur like this. The students will come into class, the teacher will write a problem on the board, the students will then spend 15 minutes, 30 minutes, however long, trying to figure out how to solve the problem. It's a new problem. It's a problem they haven't seen before. They'll spend 15, 30 minutes trying to solve the new problem, and after that 15 to 30 minutes, then they will get into groups, and groups of 3 to 5 other students, and they will discuss in the group how each of them came to think about solving the problem, how each of them came to solving the problem. So now each of them has thought about solving the problem, now they're integrating ideas, then they come back together as a class, and the teacher says, this is the proper way to solve the problem, but what are some of the other ways you came up with? And really what the difference here is the American method, you got taught that proper way, and you memorized it. And you memorized how to do it, and if you're given a similar problem, you can use your memorization of that problem to solve the problem. However, if you're given a problem that's different, you may have difficulty with it. Why will you have difficulty with it? It's because you memorized how to do a specific thing, but you didn't figure out how to actually do it. Whereas the Japanese method, you figure out how to solve the problem by thinking about the problem deeply, and when given different problems that are similar, you can solve them easily because you can apply that logical thinking to it. And really this goes into so many other ways that in science and math this can be applied. Whereas thinking deeper about an issue allows you to know more about the issue. There are other things that are involved. Asian students do spend more time being educated, though that is changing. In the US, we're getting longer school years. In Asia, they're trying to do shorter school years. But teachers have different approaches to instruction that I already talked about, this different type of learning. And the last thing is that Asian parents tend to be strongly committed to the educational process. They monitor their children's progress. They follow teachers' suggestions rather than arguing with teachers. Things like that. And again, going back to that Head Start, what is one of the most important things that they're doing in Head Start? Getting parents involved. Well, you already have a cultural influence where parents are already involved. You don't have to do that. All right, the last topic, we'll just talk about this one real quick, and that is how work and school come together, integrating work and school. In the US and Canada, about 1/3 to 1/2 of teens work part-time during their high school careers. Working students do gain knowledge about work. They gain knowledge about consumer issues, financial management, greater self-reliance. All of these things are a big benefit to having a job while you're in high school. However, so on the one hand, you get benefits to just education outside of education. On the other hand, though, students who work 20+ hours a week have lower GPAs, are less likely to go to college, are less likely to get a high-paying job later, and then they become more likely to do things like use drugs and alcohol, more likely to commit crimes. So those students in high school who are working more than 20 hours a week, all of the benefits they get from the education you get outside of the education system are wiped out by the fact of they're too exhausted to do their regular schoolwork, and in just the long run, it doesn't make up for it. Okay, so this lecture went a little bit longer than I'd intended. We talked about language, we talked about nature versus nurture, and how the nativists versus the learning theorists. We looked at development of language, we looked at some language disorders, looked at then some things relating to like the Sphere-Whorf hypothesis and how language affects cognition, as well as how culture and cognition interrelate. Then we looked at education, looking at science and math, as well as students working while they go to school. Thanks, come on back.